God just wants to see if we'll rely on him instead of trying to do it ourselves. My name is Terri Swan. I'm the lead pastor here at Salem. Delighted that you're with us for worship. Well, we are in a third week of a sermon series we've entitled The 12. The 12. What are the 12? The 12 apostles. The apostles were the ones that were the closest to Jesus. They walked alongside Jesus in his ministry. They were the ones that had those upfront and personal moments in which they got to see him heal and cure and restore. And the first and second week, we talked about those three that were closest to Jesus. Simon Peter, we talked about the first week, and then the second week we talked about James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder. And today we're going to highlight two other apostles, maybe not as well known, but they are mentioned in the Gospel of John. They are Philip and Andrew. Philip and Andrew. Now, this story that I'm about to read, or we're going to read together, is a familiar story probably to you. One of the most spectacular miracles of Jesus' ministry, the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to be in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. If you've got your phone app, you want to follow along, feel free. It'll be on the screen, and then we're going to kind of go through this together. It begins with verse 1. After this, Jesus went across the Galilee Sea, that is the Tiberias Sea. After this, we're going to talk about that. A large crowd followed him, and because they had seen the miraculous signs he had done among the sick, Jesus went up to a mountain and sat there with his disciples. And so after this, what does that mean? It starts that way. Our text begins with human need. Jesus had been busily ministering from Jerusalem to Galilee. The healings, the preaching, and he had been in this big discussion with the religious rulers about healing on the Sabbath. And so there was a big brouhaha about that. And so there was some conflict that he was in. After this, it's talking about after this big conflict that kind of spent him. He was tired. And so he wants to go away from the crowd. He wants to go up to the mountainside and be with God, just be in prayer. And so we hear this human need that is going to follow him. And so he got in a boat with his disciples and sailed across the lake to take a break. But the throngs of people, we're going to hear in just a moment, had not had enough of the master's words and deeds. And so they're going to follow him. They wanted more. They wanted more. So they tramped around the lake's north side, perhaps a distance of 15 to 20 miles, in order to be where Jesus was. So verse 4, it says, it was nearly time for Passover, the Jewish festival. This tells us when this is taking place and why so many people would be gathering. The roads would have been filled with pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem. And word is spreading quickly of Jesus and his whereabouts. Where did he get off to? They're looking for him. So the crowds begin to grow as men and women and children detoured to come and see Jesus. So there stands Jesus atop a hillside looking over Galilee, and the crowd he sought to be rid of has followed him and even grown so much into the thousands. By now it's late in the day, and supper time nears, and the stomachs begin to rumble for food. And there's more need than a meal out there as he looks out on that crowd, though. Those gathered have heard about Jesus' healings and his miracles. So those that are out in this crowd are the sick, the lonely, the adulterous, the confused, the lost, the misguided. And all that Jesus sees is human needs standing before him. So verse 5. Jesus looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him, and he asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" And Jesus said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. That's Jesus' way, right? He already knew what he was going to do, but he asked Philip a question. And Philip replied, "More than a half year's salary's worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to have even a little bit." And one of his disciples, here comes Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, Now, Andrew actually was one of the very first that Jesus asked to follow him. And then goes and gets Peter, his brother, and asks him to follow. Jesus asked Peter to follow. So Andrew's one of the first. And he says, a youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this? Let's stop there for a second. How do you read that? But what good is that for a crowd like this? We do not have the benefit of hearing tone of voice in this. We do not have the benefit of feeling the emphasis on a word, right? So I've read this way. Well, what good is that in a crowd like this? That's kind of how I've read that in the past. So what good is that in a crowd like this? But what if he said it this way? What good is that in a crowd like this? What if he went to Jesus like this and says, what good is that in a crowd like this? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass there, and they sat down, about 5,000 of them. And they only counted the men at this time. Men were the only ones counted in census reports and things like this. So we can assume that if every man brought his family with him, how many people were gathered on the mountainside, okay? Then Jesus took the bread. Then when he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting there, and he did the same with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves that had been left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, this is truly the prophet who is coming into the world. And Jesus understood that what they were about to come and force him to be their lead. Let me start that again. Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king, so he took refuge again, alone on the mountain. Now, the stories are familiar, even a familiar story, sometimes over-familiar to us. And yet, each time we hear the story, something might come to the surface new for you, like it did for me in the reading this week. We tend to focus on the miraculous ending of the abundance food for everyone, so much so that there were leftovers, right? There were leftovers. The disciples are gathering up the leftovers so that they can break them out and share them along the journey. I love leftovers. Anybody here with me? I love leftovers. I love to open the fridge and see what can I enjoy one more time, especially when I don't have to cook it, right? And so, especially after big holiday, right? When big 4th of July celebration or the big Thanksgiving or Christmas, and there's always some wonderful leftovers. And the disciples who had nothing to share at the beginning of the day are now gathering up the leftovers to take along on the journey. The story all begins, though, with this question. This leading question is perhaps just as important to the story as its grand finale. Jesus surveys the crowd and then turns to Philip. Where can we buy enough food to feed all these people? Of course, Jesus knows what he's going to do. But he's asking Philip for the answer. So why do you think he's asking Philip? Before we go there, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who Philip is. Philip was a fisherman by trade, just like Andrew and Peter. He came from the same town as they did, Bethsaida. It's northwest of the Sea of Galilee, near Capernaum, so they would have been in their home area when Jesus is asking Philip this question. And in the works of the apostles, his name is often linked with Bartholomew, or sometimes called Nathaniel. And they were very close friends. So we can assume that where Philip was, Nathaniel was pretty close by. They were always together. And it was Philip who told Nathaniel that Jesus was the one sent by God when he did not believe it. And Philip said, well, come and see. Come and see. So Philip was inviting others to follow Jesus as well. Philip was a man with a very warm heart. and a good mind. And he was responsible for seeing to the supplies for the disciples. And there you go. This is why Jesus is having the conversation with Philip. He was the road manager, you could say. He was the supply chain guy. And so Philip is being asked this question. Now, it's a practical question. Where can we buy food for all these people? And Jesus, once again, takes this moment as a teaching moment for his disciples. He wants to see if Philip will think about the problem at hand with the practical earthly approach, or if he will approach it spiritually. How does Philip respond? Logically, right? He's a logical guy. He points out it would take more than a half year's wage to buy enough bread. Philip went to the natural tendency to think in terms of human resources and limitations. And Andrew, one of the first disciples, as I said, to follow Jesus, the brother of Peter, points out the young man that has these few loaves and fish. To be sure, Andrew sees the crowd, the hunger, the expense, but he also sees Jesus. You hear that? He also sees Jesus. We're told in the text that the little boy carried with him this picnic lunch of 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Now, this would have been barley bread, the cheapest sort of food, and the fish were likely pickled, sort of like our sardines today. Little did the family know when they were packing this picnic lunch that they were going to feed over 5,000 people that day with this lunch. But this is what Andrew found in the midst of the problem. And this is what the lad offered to Jesus in the midst of 5,000 rumbling stomachs. A small gift that God makes an abundant gift. There was a huge need, there was a woeful inadequacy, and yet these few loaves and fish were given as an offering. He gave what he could. He gave what he had. And Philip responds with human limitations instead of God's possibilities. Now, I'm not going to point any fingers at Philip here. How many of us do the same thing, right? How many of us do that same thing? We look at our limitations, our inadequacies. Back when Joe and I were raising our young daughters, we would often have this discussion in our household, especially around bill time. You know, I always tried to avoid things when bills were coming around. But, you know, this is the kind of discussion we had when we were young. We had house payment and grocery bills. How could we give to the church when we couldn't afford it? I mean, you have that question and that discussion in your own households. We were living in a fear of scarcity at the time. Absolutely wrong approach here. We were thinking logically, we were thinking earthly, and frankly, we were thinking selfishly. As we grew in our discipleship and our relationship with God grew stronger, we started taking those essential steps in faith of stepping out and giving in small ways. We started small. Just like that young boy, we offered what we could. A few fish and loaves, so to speak. And guess what? Our family paid our bills. There was food on the table. God provided. And we continue to give and increase our giving over time, and God showed us the abundance of his provision, even giving us leftovers at times. Giving to the needs of others, church, is part of our discipleship. It's part of our calling. And the church is God's vehicle for making sure that we can care for God's people. I mean, really, it's all God's anyway, isn't it? God just wants to see if we'll rely on him instead of trying to do it ourselves. Jesus is asking Philip a question to see if he's going to respond with faith or logic. Jesus often led the disciples into situations where they had to rely on him, just like he calls us into situations at times where we must rely on him. And by asking Philip the question, Jesus is inviting him to consider who is with him. Who's with him? The one who has the power over nature, over sickness, over hunger, and even death. The question becomes a lesson. Will you look to human solutions, or will you trust in the power and compassion of Christ? The answer is the answer for all of us, isn't it, church? It's not about bread and fish. It's about belief. It's about faith. Jesus was preparing them just as he's preparing us. The moment on the hillside with more than 5,000 people foreshadows the disciples' future role in feeding people spiritually. Jesus is beginning to teach them that the work of ministry requires dependence on God, not just calculations or strategy or logic. The test wasn't to shame Philip, but to prepare him to see the power of Jesus and to build trust that would be crucial for his future ministry. Can you imagine the amazement the apostles had? The wonder and the awe that they experienced as they distributed that food along the hillside, as they continued to reach in the basket, and there was just more food and more food and more food to share. Can you imagine the feelings as they gathered up the leftovers to take with them? In the end, Jesus' question to Philip wasn't just about feeding the crowd. It was about shaping the disciples. It was about opening their eyes to the power of God. And in doing so, he reminds us that faith grows not in certainty, but in moments when we're invited to trust that Christ is more than enough. The test revealed more than a logical problem. It uncovered the human tendency we all have to rely on what we can see and calculate, rather than the one who provides abundantly. You know, Story Spark Camp, Pastor Tim mentioned it just a little while ago. I'm going to invite the band to come on up, back up. But Story Spark Camp has been going on here at Salem. My granddaughter's been going through the camp experience. The children are spending days with fun activities and reading some of their favorite stories. And I just want to thank those that have been volunteering to come and read with children. You are giving a small gift. You're giving what you can, and God is using that in abundance to multiply that gift. How many of you remember the book Stone Soup? Stone Soup. I read that to you all the time. When she was a little girl, I used to read that all the time to her. And it teaches such an important lesson. As the story goes, each person is called to put a few things in the pot that started out with just a few stones and some water. And soon a neighbor will bring a few potatoes, and there's some celery, and there's some carrots. And before long, the pot is filled with this big, aromatic, beautiful tasting soup that is shared with the entire community. I love that, because that's what we're called to do. We are called to give, to be like the young boy with a little bread and a fish, a couple of fish, and let God multiply it into abundance. So the next time you see a need, an earthly need, a human need, and feel the earthly limitations of life, don't look into the hillside, but look into the basket. Look into the basket. See how God is going to multiply that and provide. Don't count the difficulties presented. Look at the possibilities. Don't measure your problems. Measure God's power.